everyone, this is Michael with the Arkham Horrors, and today I'm doing a little behind the scenes of my latest soundtrack, The Blob That Devours Everything. This soundtrack is inspired by the Arkham Horror the card game standalone scenario, The Blob That Ate Everything, and like that particular scenario, the soundtrack is heavily influenced by 1950s alien invasion B-movies. And the feel that I was going for with this particular soundtrack was to match the style of those 1950s horror movies, as well as composer Bernard Herrmann, who scored the majority of Alfred Hitchcock's films. For those of you who aren't familiar with Bernard Herrmann's work, he did the music for films like Psycho and Citizen Kane and Taxi Driver, and earlier in his career he also did a handful of science fiction and fantasy films as well. So when starting out work on this particular soundtrack, the first thing that I did, which is what I usually do when I'm starting a project, is I put together a collection of instruments. I create my own orchestra. And speaking of Bernard Herrmann, one of the sound libraries that features prominently throughout this soundtrack is the Spitfire Audio Bernard Herrmann Composer Toolkit. When creating sounds, he liked to put together combinations of instruments and do arrangements that really leaned heavily into making the listener feel unsettled. He was very much an innovator in his field in terms of having a very identifiable sound that people still are influenced by to this day, including myself. The challenge for this particular soundtrack, with wanting to be faithful to this type of music, if you were to pull up on Spotify, for example, a playlist of music from soundtracks from 1950s horror films, for example, you'll see that the pieces are actually quite short. And that is because the kind of work and effort that goes into the arrangements are so meticulous that you really can only kind of do about a minute and a half to 3 minutes before you start to burn out. And the challenge for me was that I wanted to have enough of those style pieces in here to give you lots and lots of flavor, but it really just, it would have taken me years to do a lot of that kind of stuff and carry it out throughout the entirety of the soundtrack. So at points in the album, you're going to hear things that sound very, with lots of movement and have lots of different instruments layering on top of each other. The flip side to that is the other approach that I took to the album was to lean heavily on creating these sound beds using vintage synthesizer instruments in the style of what Bernard Herrmann was using, for example. Here's an example of kind of leaning more into the electronic style. But again, still trying to make it sound like something that would have been able to have been composed back in the day. So we've got, as our bed, we just have this whooshy kind of sound here. And then we've got these kind of percussive sounds that are just kind of ringing out and ringing out and ringing out. And here is a couple of Bernard Herrmann synthesizers. When layered up together, you've got this very retro sounding, very experimental. It's what they would have considered very experimental back in the day. And then over all that, I've got these swells using a grand piano that's been treated with like the strings have attached to them little rattles and paper cups and ping pong balls and stuff like that, so that when the hammers hit the strings, there's additional resonances going on the strings. And then here we've got a little extra stuff here with this tape piano, which again sounds very primitive. And then we've got this, it's doubled up with this Herrmann vibraphone to give it a little more organic sound. So today, primarily what we're going to focus on is a track from the album that I actually used a clip from a 1950s movie called The Invaders from Mars and scored the clip. I actually took two clips and kind of cut them together. So what I decided to do is just use this 3-ish minute clip to inspire myself to really compose each individual layer to sound like it would have sounded if it were 70 years ago and someone was given the task of creating a brand new piece of music from scratch using this footage. Let's take a look at it first and then we can talk about it. So there are a lot of different music libraries that went into the creation of this particular track. Throughout the entire soundtrack, there are 3 music libraries that really stand out and are featured heavily throughout the entirety. The first one is from Project Sam, and it is a library called Pandora, and this is part of their Symphobia series, and it is a collection of samples of really old school arrangements of brass and strings and percussion. And the nice thing about these is that when they recorded the samples, they wanted to make sure that they worked in a modern environment. So what they did is they set these up where you could actually have this little slider here that allows you to sync up your music to hit the right crescendo. So for example, right here, like if I wanted to have it hit right on the beat, so the Pandora series features heavily throughout the soundtrack, and primarily in this particular track, it features mostly for its percussion instruments. For example, we've got a lot of timpani going on here at the very beginning. One of the other libraries that features pretty heavily in this particular soundtrack is the Spitfire Albion U-East collection, which is similarly a collection of orchestral phrases and articulations, again, which are designed with a horror aesthetic or a tension aesthetic, a mood aesthetic. So for example, you've got these high strings. And it's very useful when you are quickly trying to zip through, especially something like this, where there's a lot going on. It's just a quick way for me to be able to build a layer on top of the larger framework of the music to just give a little extra movement, a little extra tension, a little extra emphasis on a particular thing. The kind of showcase for this particular soundtrack, though, is the Bernard Herrmann Orchestra. The composer toolkit here has tons and tons of various articulations and pairings of instruments so that it sounds as close as possible to the types of things that Bernard Herrmann would have been doing when he was scoring a film. Well, here is a complete studio orchestra recorded together. Here is a piccolo and flute together. Here's a flute and clarinet in a trill. So there's all this really nice detailed level recordings of these instruments that just really evoke that era of the way that they recorded orchestras back then. The other thing that this particular collection has is a whole bunch of synthesizers that are just, the word vintage isn't even the right word, they're antique synthesizers. They're very primitive in what they could do. So what they did is they sampled a bunch of these really antique primitive synthesizers very deeply, and they used as many different types of settings as they possibly could so that it allows you to recreate as faithfully as possible the sounds of these original synthesizers. So for example, there's this particular one here. And it comes with all these different microphone positions, and it comes with all these different settings that will allow you a different sound, and you can manipulate and dial in exactly the type of sound that you're looking for. And then we've got these other kind of what are called envelopes here to really give you all of this freedom in, adding these types of things, which it does. These synthesizers really do give you a sense of, they feel like what would have been used back in the late 40s to mid 60s probably, and that was hugely inspiring. So let's just take you through from the beginning here, and we can listen to these various sections piece by piece. So just that first 40 some odd seconds, there isn't a lot going on at this point. It's really just about building a slow rise to a reveal. So we've got these orchestral swarm strings here, which are just kind of a wavy, kind of flowy little string thing going on. And then we've got this harp from the BBC orchestra from Spitfire. And then we've got this really subtle clarinet sound coming in here. And I'm using a legato to give it this really smooth feel between instruments. And I thought that that really worked nicely when these layered together. Then we've got these Bernard Herrmann strings here, which transition very quickly into this trombone flutter. And then that partners up with this trill in this clarinet, which again just feels very of that time, And then all of that ties together nicely with these pulsing brass sounds from the Spitfire Kepler Orchestra. So moving on to the landing of the spaceship, I wanted to use a lot of various percussion instruments to give the sense of kind of winding down. So that's why I've got these little shaker type toys. Again, it's very subtle when layered together. And those pair really well with this harp swell from Pandora. So what we've got here in this section is, as the soldier is sneaking towards the crash site, you've got this staccato thing happening here with the bass strings, the cello strings. And you've got this trombone doing a little descending melody coupled with some high strings. Again, just trying to build a little bit of tension. One of the other libraries that features kind of clutch in this particular collection of music is the Metropolis Arc Zero library. This is from Orchestral Tools, and what it is they started putting out these orchestral collections that were kind of inspired by old Hollywood. Think like the Batman animated series type arrangements of instruments, and they put out this thing called Arc Zero a little bit later on, which I guess was sort of the early version of what they were going for. Is they recorded the entire orchestra together instead of recording the strings separately and the horns and then the woodwinds. So what they've got here is this collection of articulations done by what's called a tutti orchestra, which means when the orchestra plays the exact same type of articulation, note, style together the exact same way. So for example, again, it just speeds up the process if you're looking to do a little section like this here. I don't have to try and find a swell for a string section, a swell for a brass section, a swell for a woodwind section. It's all there that I could just very quickly integrate into the music. So as we continue on here, we've got the soldier here is stealthily trying to make his way towards the impact site. And I'm using that same staccato melody, but now I'm layering it up with a glockenspiel and a clarinet, and I'm using a full string section here, and I've got them in octaves. That just works really well with the melody that's plucking out here between the low strings and the trombones. So again, we've got some of these little fluttery things happening thanks to some paper snares. And then we also have a marimba here that's doing a little roll. So together that makes this really nice kind of layered, fluttery sound. So that it's not all once again I'm using the grand orchestra busy as kind we're of building that you would hear climax of this particular track. In the other tracks, we want more instruments coming in, telling the same story of this stealth approach that he's doing. The orchestra is leaning into this great tubular bell sound, which then sets off these horns. And that is all layered up with this percussion here. And then we've got just a little bit of this U-East string phrase. Which is very subtle, but again, it just helps to bring a little extra movement. And once again, we've got these trilly clarinets playing this descending melody. So a big hallmark of these types of movies is like when they're trying to illustrate that something terrible has happened to a character, they love to do these big kind of descending runs of instruments, and I tried to recreate that as faithfully as possible. And I thought it was a very effective use of kind of the way that they used to build tension and also um, kind of imply tragedy. Unlike a lot of the other soundtracks that I do, where I do a combination of more classic and modern and alternative and ambient and experimental, I try to do a little bit of this, a little bit of that in a lot of my soundtracks, so that when people are putting together playlists, like on Spotify, for example, they can pick and choose the types of tracks that they like, instead of something like this where I do the entire soundtrack in one particular type of style. If you're not interested in that old 50s Hollywood kind of thing, you won't use any of the tracks in this particular album. I was going for a very specific idea when creating this, and that meant a lot of things like using percussion loops and things like that were just kind of out of the question right off the bat. So for example, here is a track called The Vulnerable Heart, where rather than using just a loop of some sort of percussion element, very modern sounding, I went with just a piece of kind of electronic noise to be a drum type sound. And this would have been very like something they would have done back then, using a very primitive version of a synthesizer to make these sounds. And I've got it kind of doubled up a little bit with a marimba, a little bit of echo on the marimba, but other than that, which again they would have done back then, and this becomes kind of the basis of this particular track. But again, not anything too modern sounding. And then over that, put some Bernard Herrmann piccolos and flutes and low woodwinds. And this little whispery sounding flute. So this was just a nice way for me to kind of combine orchestral sounds with some more electronic stuff to mix things up a little bit, add a little extra layer. So these various ways that I was able to kind of mix things up a little bit so that it didn't all sound samey. There still was variety for people to listen to. Like I said earlier, it would have taken me probably a year to do the nearly 2 hours of music that I ended up putting into this if I was doing it all with that big, busy, full orchestral arrangement style. It would have taken forever for me to do that. And I just would not have enjoyed it. It was an enjoyable exercise doing it once for a handful of tracks over the course of a few weeks, but to have dedicated, unless I was actually being paid to score like a film that was meant to have that kind of sound, the effort that went into it would have been more frustration, I think, than satisfaction. So I hope you enjoyed this little walkthrough of the Blob That Devours Everything. This soundtrack is, at least for now, going to be exclusively available for purchase and download on my Patreon page, and you can find that at patreon.com/thearkhamhorrors. For the time being, the standalone scenarios that I'm going to be creating are going to be available exclusively there, and they're going to be kind of like this, where I think they'll have a more singular focus in the sound. There'll be a little less of kind of the mixed bag stuff that you get with the other soundtracks that are available. So please consider subscribing to me on Patreon, where you'll get not only the most current information and news about the projects that I'm working on, but you'll also be able to get access to the long-form soundscapes, which are where I pick an idea like being lost in the woods or in a haunted house, and take tracks from my back catalog of music and curate a collection of music, primarily ambient music, but I also string them together with sound effects and environmental sounds and things like that, so that it really is this immersive experience to enhance your game playing. And those are available twice monthly on the Patreon page. The page also is where I put all kinds of goodies, extended tracks, bonus tracks, videos of clips of movies that I used to score a particular piece of music for an upcoming album or a past album, things like that. The Patreon page is becoming kind of the primary hub for what I'm doing. So if you like what you're seeing here, please consider going on over to my Patreon page and subscribing. Thanks so much, and take care.